Morning, everybody. It's Brian Blanchard over at Oakwood Systems Group. I'm here to talk today a little bit about ALM and some of the really cool tools that became available to us at TechEd and Build. For those who couldn't make it, it was a great launching pad for a number of new components to the TFS and Visual Studio Suite. So today we're going to cover everything from Visual Studio 2012, some of the updates and releases that came out, all the way through the newest, latest, and greatest stuff in 2013. And to help me today, my co-presenter Chris Roberts here to join us. Chris, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure thing. My name is Chris Roberts. I'm an architect at Oakwood Systems Group as well. I focus on a variety of things, including the ALM stack and the Microsoft Suite and application engineering for enterprise.
Wonderful. Thanks, Chris. So starting out, why do we care about ALM and what's new in Visual Studio? We've all seen Visual Studio at this point, and things haven't changed radically. So what's different? Well, at a high level, the big thing that's changed is the way the application lifecycle is trending. So in the business world today, people are starting to understand more and more that the change is the new normal. The waterfall world isn't quite what it used to be, and we're seeing more and more agile adoption to keep up with change in the business world. And this has led to a number of new feature sets and new components that we need to look at a little deeper. The first is the BML Virtuous Cycle, or Build, Measure, Learn. The second is continuous feedback and delivery. Another is this blurring of functional boundaries. Where does an app dev team end and a BI team begin? And where does the business really fit into that, or QA or others? And then if we look on a global scale, what about distributed teams? How do they fit into an instance of TFS or Visual Studio running localized code? So these are some of the things that we're going to look at today, and I promise we're going to go from PowerPoint coma right into presentations and get into some good geeky stuff as well. So first thing I wanted to cover is that BML Virtuous Cycle. The concept here that drives a lot of what we're going to see in the next year or two is this concept of build, measure, learn. In the past, we've all been focused around dev, dev, dev. How do we build better apps? How do we integrate into the business better? How do we give them more of what they need? But now the focus inside the app dev lifecycle has gotten bigger. In addition to dev, we're also focused on ops. So once we build it, how do we measure it and make sure that it's actually delivering what we promised? How do we make sure the server's functioning? Those are many things that we have to consider. Then the next component is commerce. Once we put an app out there, what can we learn from that application? How can we get better? How can we do more as an application development team? So this is the BML Virtuous Cycle. It's what drives a lot of the development here at Oakwood, and it's what's been driving Microsoft's development decisions for some time. And this has also shaped the modern application lifecycle. Application lifecycle is something you've probably heard referred to in the past as ALM. Now with the BML processes added to it, it becomes more of a continuous value delivery process, starting at the top here with the concept of define. So creating that customer connection, that ideation, or that innovation component of application development. And that all lives inside of your product backlog, which gives us some cool tool sets we're going to look at TFS. Once we get past that definition, how do we build? What's the way to just get working and get those ideas to life and actually build out the software? So that's that concept of develop and implement. From there, we have our development pipeline and what comes out of that, and how do we make that operate? How do we get working software into production, realize that value that we've created, and get that into the hands of users? And once it's out of our hands as developers, our job isn't done. Every one of us who's ever made it to a senior developer track ends up with 2, 5, 20 applications that you have to support the entire lifetime of that application. Well, how do we get that out of our hands so we can go back to building great things and adapt so that we can now expose some of that control to others and let them experiment with how to support this best without us having to hold their hands? And throughout this process, how do we create a good, solid feedback loop so that we have actionable learning in everything that we do and say? Well, here's a few things of how we can get there from a procedural perspective, and in just a moment we'll look at this from a software perspective. The first piece is that customer engagement, both in that product backlog and in our implementation, so that our customers are a part of our day-to-day development cycle, and the tool sets for that have gotten so much better. Chris, you want to talk about a few of those at a high level so that people can see what's coming? Things like the feedback loop or any of those pieces?
Sure. So what we're going to see in our Team Foundation Server demo today, in particular, are two things that I think are pretty relevant there. We have the feedback solicitation tool, which I think is going to be one of the killer features in the the TFS stack going forward. And we also have the idea of doing that type of feedback from within the testing tools that we have, so that we can get integrated captures of screen recordings, video feedback and capturing of desktops. We can capture the audio discussion, so that our customer engagement isn't something where we're putting something out in front of them and it becomes the customers go off and have their discussions and then they come back and we get a couple of bullet points in an email. Instead, we're going to capture that actual discussion with our customers, and that's going to get checked back into TFS, and we're going to be able to actually associate that with the user stories that we were asking them for feedback on.
That's such an amazing tool set. And then going beyond that, we've got some other new tools as well, like MTM and some of the ways it helps us manage and automate the quality piece. And I don't know if many of you heard, but one of the most recent acquisitions by the DevDiv or the Microsoft.NET team was a tool set called InRelease from a company called InCycle. Very powerful approach to using simplistic workflows to drive release management, so that once we're done with merging our code base and preparing it and building it at the end of the night, it's ready to just escalate right away to our dev site, and when possible, even our QA sites. So there's a lot more control and functionality in that release process. The next stage is that live site mentality. Once it's gone from our development pipeline to the real world, there's a number of new tools, one in particular called OpsMan that we'll look at today. But the whole System Center suite is designed to wrap around our code base. Watch those servers that are powering our code, make sure performance is there. When problems arise, help us see them better. We'll talk about all that as well. And at the center of everything that we see here in this new Microsoft Developer Division journey is the team structure and delivery cadence. How do we bring all of these teams together in one centralized tool? And that's why we've seen some changes this year where TFS isn't this ancillary piece that's tied to Visual Studio. It's the core of everything that the Visual Studio team does and builds. So we're going to see a lot of those changes as we go through some of these tools today. So next thing I wanted to point out is we talked a little bit about changes, the new norm. Just wanted to demonstrate one really quick piece, and this also ties back to Visual Studio as well. This is the actual delivery cadence from within Microsoft. So the team that's building our dev tools, they're working on really aggressive launch cycles. They started with the 2012 launch in September, and then right away hit the Update 1 launch in November, the DevOps capability in January. We've already seen Update 2 and Update 3 come in, and 2013 is right down the road. And the main reason why I bring this up is because if you look down at the bottom of this chart, what's really important is that inside the Microsoft teams, they've adopted these 3-week service delivery sprints. Now, every team may not be that way, but the overwhelming driver inside Microsoft is that Agile is the way that they're keeping up with us. And what's really amazing if you dig into these teams is in that 3-week sprint, these guys are building the tool sets that we're going to use, but then they have to test it and demo it. So they're building an app just like you or I would on a day-to-day basis and making it function to show how that new piece of the tool set works. Really cool process that we can mimic in our everyday development cycles. So that brings us to the end of the high-level stuff. Let's get into the real meat and potatoes of what's going on here. We're going to focus on 2 high-level points when it comes to Visual Studio 12 and TFS 12. The first is that Agile, and if you still need, waterfall planning tools so that you have the tool set you need to manage the process, and then quality enablement. There's some other tools we're going to talk about along the way for the geekier ones in the crowd with us. So Chris, I'm going to turn this over to you to cover some of this Agile planning. And we're going to look at it first from a 2012 perspective, and then afterwards dig in a little bit deeper to some of the changes in 2013.
Sure thing. So what you're seeing now is actually one of the development projects that I'm leading here at Oakwood. And you can see our burn down chart here. If you're familiar with burn down charts, what this looks like is started out up here, came down a little bit. We got a little bit more information to finish our estimating the second day of our sprint. And from here, we had a little bit of a plateau for a weekend. We can see right here we had a little bit of a, after that weekend, a little bit more plateau. That's a couple people being out sick, and then everybody gets back, and we fire on all cylinders, and we drive toward the end of a sprint. So in order to get this kind of view and exposure on what your team is up to, you need to go through the process of the Agile planning behind that. So let's kind of talk about that. So from here, what we would do is we would define our product backlog or list off all of our user stories and catalog those in TFS. So Brian, if we wanted to add a new product backlog item for the product we're working on right now, we have 2 different views that we could look at. We could either choose plus product backlog item here, which will create for us a product backlog item that we can fill out, and you'll see that the iteration is our current sprint. So on the project we're working on right now, we're under our first release, and we're 4 sprints in. So we're about 8 weeks into the development cycle. So what I could do here is give it a nice short title, and that short title might be something like, I don't know, let's say we're going to create enhanced logging views. And that would just be a title that would make it really easy to see and long list of stuff so that we can identify it very quickly. And then one of the ways we like to use this particular Scrum template is to go through in our descriptions, and we would describe our user story. So as a ops person in my staff, I need the ability to drill down into logging view, into log entries a little deeper to get correlating information so that I can rapidly diagnose some kind of issue. Okay, and we'll actually show you good tools for that too.
Let's not type all that, Chris. For now, let's just put in something along the lines of do stuff.
You bet. So we have some user stories built up in here. We would define our acceptance criteria, which is terribly important. That's going to be our view for what is a successful delivery of this user story. What I like to do is allow our business analysts to go in and add some attachments, any kind of supporting artifacts that we might need in order to decipher what that acceptance criteria is. If we have any other related user stories, we might come in here and add a link to them. So we can go through and we can set that up right in here. And what we'll do after that is we'll save this into our backlog. And again, I say from this screen, it actually goes right into the current iteration. And that doesn't work well for my current sprint, because as you can see, we're right at the end, and I don't want to add anything new to it and surprise my developers less than 1 hour before their sprint review.
Yeah, that's probably not such a good idea.
Yeah, I don't think they would enjoy that. So let's take a look at this. We're going to go to View Backlog.
One question from the audience, Chris, before you move on. You were just talking about user stories. Could someone do the same thing with requirements in a PMBOK or waterfall world?
Absolutely. So the way Team Foundation Server is constructed is around these things called process templates. Process templates define the structure of all of these different things: product backlog items, tasks, bugs. You see we have impediments and test cases. So this is a Scrum process template designed around Agile. There is a CMMI process template that comes out with Team Foundation Server as well, and that's a little more in line with that methodology. You get terminology and work items for things like requirements. You get things like your risks and your issues and all of the things that you would normally see in your project plan. And it's also worth noting, if that's your arena, you can tie Team Foundation Server directly to Project Server, and you can have a bidirectional data pump. So I could be in that environment. I could set up a project plan, tie that to a team project, define my high-level requirements within Project Server, and I can push it over to Team Foundation Server to let my development team do the work breakout structure.
That's wonderful. That's a really great approach. We also have another question come from the audience as well, and I know it's a little early for questions, but let's definitely keep them flooding in. The next one is about members and whether or not we can tie those to AD. I know you talked about covering the member portal and all that. Don't necessarily feel like you have to go into it now, but let's make sure we come back to that when you do.
Okay, sure. I'll make a note of that, and we're going to talk about teams, and I'll show you how teams work, and that's where we can talk about Active Directory there. So from the Agile planning standpoint, I would describe my backlog. Everything would go into that backlog, and then we would define our releases. So we would define releases by going to Configure, Schedule, and Iterations. And here you see a lot of interesting things underneath of our project, broken out by different BI releases and our app dev releases, which are not prefixed with anything. So we started this team project as principally an app dev effort. Then we added a 16-man BI team to it, and at that point we ended up breaking it out into teams, and we defined separate releases and separate sprints for them. So within one team project, we can have a separate set of sprints for different sub-teams going. So after I've defined my sprints, I would then go through and assign different product backlog items to those sprints. A variety of ways we can do that as well. But let's take a look at our backlog. And here's my product backlog on the top left. Anything that's not in a sprint, if I wanted to put in a sprint, I could just right-click it, say Move to Iteration, and pick which sprint. Now you'll also see none of these are prefixed with BI. This is context sensitive based on the fact that I am in the app dev team only. So it makes it easier for me to figure out where I want to schedule these things. So after I define my schedule and I define my different sprints, then I just go through and I assign all my different product backlog items to those sprints. Then the process is we sit down with the development team and we go to our board.
You know what, before you go to the board, one quick thing on the product backlog.
Sure.
This is a new tool set in 2012. For those at home, there's a little bar in the top center there that says forecast based on velocity. And velocity is kind of our expectation of what we think we can deliver this week. At Oakwood, we like to work velocity into the concept of story points from an Agile perspective, but that could be the man hours you have that week, or it could be the number of flamingos you can fit in a room. It really doesn't matter. As long as you can map that number back to the way you rank a user story or a requirement or feature or anything else. And that's where these lines that you see for Sprint 5, Sprint 6, Sprint 7 have come from. The teams previously estimated the effort of each of these different user stories, and we've said that, you know, we can handle about 60 user stories this sprint. So if you look above the Sprint 5 line, that's what we feel right now that our team can take on in the next sprint. So it looks like a lot, but it's a very realistic effort based on their understanding of the work ahead of them.
Yeah, and we went through that exact same effort for our current sprint that we're wrapping up now, and you'll see from the burn down that it was pretty much spot on.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, we always have a goal in our development team of concluding before the final day of our sprint, so that we have a little bit of time to do some testing diligence along with our test team, get the developers reintegrated there, and help the testers find any of the the little niche features that maybe they're having trouble tracking down. And you can see we accomplished that here as well. So definitely that Agile planning tooling and Team Foundation Server is working well for us. So
sorry to cut you off there.
Yeah, no problem.
Ready to go to the board?
So yeah, from here, let's take a quick look at our Kanban board. So I think the only tasks you're going to see left in progress are going to be principally around our testers. So you can see there are an awful lot of tasks over here in the done column. That's what I like to see. So what you're looking at here is we have a plugin for Team Foundation Server, an extension from Tiago Pascal that adds the actual work item numbers to our board, and if any tasks were blocked, we would see that as well. So we get some nice visuals out of that. I highly recommend that extension. I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to surprise this tester by marking her task as blocked, and you'll see that updates to give us a quick visual feedback that that is in fact now blocked, and so that she doesn't give me any grief whenever we conclude this meeting. I'm going to go ahead and set it back to unblocked. All right, so these are what we call a swim lane, and a swim lane is every row in the Kanban board. The left hand is our user story or product backlog item over where you see 141. And if we scroll through, you can see all the different user stories that we're working on and the current state of our tasks. Okay, so to go in here and add new tasks, we just click the plus, and that would allow me to add a new task, and it will automatically associate with that product backlog item or user story. This board is available to you if you're using a CMMI template. So if you're doing more traditional project management approach and you want to add, do the work breakout structure in here, you're perfectly welcome to do so.
One really neat thing about this board is it's also got drag and drop capabilities. So it really accelerates the time that your developers can interact with the system. So if we do have a task on here, like this demo task that Chris is putting in place, we can start out by discussing the remaining work that's left. We can choose who we want to assign that to. And then from here, that individual can drag it to in progress, change that work, and say, I'm almost done. Okay, now I'm fully done, and I'm going to set that to 0. Or just drag it right into the done column. And it just moves it right over seamlessly so that we don't have to open a lot of things and interact with the raw data. We can just do it through a visualization.
Perfect. So let me show you a quick gotcha that a lot of people ask me about. More work was discovered. It wasn't quite done. Look what we see, an error there. What that's actually trying to indicate to you is that you should come back in here and say, if you found more work, please tell us how much more work you found. And everything will be happy.
And what's really great is Chris mentioned earlier those process templates. Those things are highly configurable and editable so that you can make up your own rules like that. Maybe you want to make it to where someone can only take something back to a work in progress if they reassign it to a new member or some other task.
That's right. And if you have more states than just to do and in progress and done because you perhaps have some kind of compliance concerns and you need to go through some kind of extra review stage, that can be easily added to any of the process templates that you have. And in fact, you can go a step further and you can restrict the transitions by security groups if you'd like to, so that
One other view of that board, sorry to interrupt you there, Chris. If you can go back to that board, we showed it by user story. Someone's just asking about showing workload by team member and resources. So if we flip over to the team member category, we can see a number of developers on this particular project, and we have a couple of things that are unassigned at the very top there. If we were to assign that to, say, Ben Farrick, who's the first one in the line there, we would see that actual task move into his bucket of tasks to do. And while there's no estimate of time on that one because it's something that's still kind of more of a nebulous task in there, it would show that time. And on another view that we don't have available right here, we could actually balance out our resources and see who, if anybody, was overtasked or had too much on their plate. So really good planning tools built into the system right there. So great question, definitely.
Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and have that quick discussion about teams and how do we handle this. So this is another challenge some people will run into is they'll say, well, I really have some separate development efforts going on here, but they're all related to the same team project and maybe even related to the same code base. So how can we define concurrent sprints with different subsets of developers perhaps? The way we do that is with teams. So let's take a quick look at that. So I'm going to go back here and I'm going to show you I have 23 members on this particular development team. We have another team involved in this project and they'll have their own burn down chart. They'll have their own list of favorite tiles here. And they'll have their own sprint planning. So I'm going to click on this gear on the top right to go to Administer Settings. From here, you'll see we actually have 16 members on a business intelligence team as well. So it's actually just as easy as going into our team or their team and saying, I'd like to add a Windows user group or a TFS group. So here's your tie-in to Active Directory. So this will, in fact, allow me to browse the entirety of my AD. So we can find that there. That, I believe, answers one of the questions that we had from the audience. And one thing I'll tell you, though, is when you're working inside of your team projects and you are going to assign somebody to do some work, let's go back to that board and let's go back to that team member view. And let's take one of these unassigned tasks. If I'm going to select who I want this to be assigned to, I have to look at all of this Active Directory group, which is all of our members, which is scrolling very quickly, and there are quite a few people in our Oakwood Active Directory. That's another level of customization you could do within the process template. If you'd like to restrict that to only a subset of people who are perhaps in your Active Directory group called developers, we can do that. And then we can shrink down that the menu of people that you see there.
I think the other question as well is, can we add users who aren't in Active Directory? So if we were in that business development tab there looking at the teams that you had pulled up earlier, you talked about an AD or a TFS group. Is that a group inside of AD or is that a different group?
So we actually have a separate set of groups that can be created within Team Foundation Server to be managed directly by Team Foundation Server. And you are still going to be adding people from your Active Directory to these groups. And you can define and apply these groups from Team Foundation Server here. That's kind of a sorting and a hierarchy system that gets you rapidly able to apply contributor permissions, which are going to be consistent across your Team Foundation Server projects and your SharePoint team sites, allocated to teams without a lot of extra work in AD.
So the limitation is still that if you've installed TFS locally, that you are bound by AD users.
Yeah, you're still going to be working with Active Directory users.
Yeah. Now there are some ways to go beyond that, though, that I've noticed. If you're using the full SharePoint portal for TFS, you can actually use SharePoint rules to allow people to have some read-only levels of access in certain artifacts.
Correct.
Definitely can't interact with the full TFS, but they can get involved. So the CEO of a customer or the CEO of your own company being able to come in and see some basic data is an acceptable process. If for those that do need to go beyond AD and invite in end users that are outside of your Active Directory group, there's also the ability to use Team Foundation Service, which is the web-based service approach to TFS, and we'll use that to demo some of the 2013 features in a minute. So we see a flood of additional questions coming in. Let's save some of those till the very end because we've got about 35 minutes left and we haven't even got into the really cool developer tools just yet.
Okay.
So hopping back over to our slide deck here, we talked about the Agile waterfall planning. That's just one point on one slide. The next thing that we wanted to talk about in 2012 is some of the quality enablement stuff. So when we talk about 2012, we've got all these cool tools for managing developers and managing code. Well, we've also got great tools for managing quality. And this is stuff that really has not been around before in TFS to make it easier to create a quality product. We've always had to rely on things like Mercury or other third-party software for that. Well, what you're looking at here is a tool set called MTM. And you can build out tests inside of TFS by adding test cases. I don't know if you saw that in the drop-down Chris was flipping through. But what we're looking at here is another view that's for testing end users. So we can see here in Sprint 1 of that app dev release we were looking at, we've got all kinds of different tests. And we can easily create a new test case by just right-clicking here and saying, let's add a test, or let's do a new test case. And we can just tell it that we want to test something. And from there, we can say, well, the first action is open a browser. And second action is load website. But you know what? Let's try to automate this a little bit. We can do something really simple and say, well, let's load app website. And now immediately we have this parameter down here. And we can say that we want to do multiple different websites. First one is going to be Microsoft.com. And the next one will be something else. Just to make the Microsoft guys a little bit jealous, let's say we'll open Google. It's not wanting me to add, oh, there we go. Insert parameter. Oh, we're actually not at the stage where we can add multiple parameters. I have to save this first. So we'll back out of that, but we can actually add multiple different parameter values. There we go. It went through into the autosave. So we can add google.com. Now we've got multiple tests we can run, and you could do this with variables inside your system, create a real test case, and we'll see in just a second how that all plays out. So let's say we made that test case and we saved it off. I'm just going to not save because we really don't want to screw with actual tests in our system. And let's look at another test, this view HIPAA required information. From here we can say that we have a requirement that there's some HIPAA required information that people have to be able to look at for the system to be considered compliant. And it has its own tests already defined and different steps that the end user can take. So we'll just keep an eye on that test. So our testers go through and say these are all the different things that we want to test. And they're each tied to different user stories, so happy path test as well as an anomaly test.
Yeah, so just real quick, the way that we actually got all of these into this is we defined this test suite, and you can go to add requirements, and you can query all of the different requirements, and you can refine this to say, I want, for example, to see everything that's only in our current sprint by adding an iteration path here. I won't go through all of that, but we can click on iteration path, and if we change that and say we're interested in everything that was in release 1, that'll give us a query for all of those. And we can do a select all, and we can say add requirements to plan right here. Brian, that's actually how we put together that test, test suite for this particular project, so I'll let you go back to it. But I thought you guys might find that interesting out in the audience that we can add and build these little test suites so rapidly off of our user stories.
Yeah, great deal of automation built in right there. So now let's say we built out that whole plan, we built a number of tests behind it, and you're getting close to halfway through the sprint, so you've got some visuals they can play with, and it's time to actually start testing some of these things. So we go simply from the Plan tab at the top to the Test tab, and we go in, let's look at that same HIPAA required information one. We can actually click on it if we've already tested it, and click that little green check mark above it to say this test is passed. That'll record that this test was successful. But we could go a step further, and we can actually go to the left of that and hit Run, and this is where MTM gets really cool. We run this test, and it would load up a browser to the right, which we can't see because we're in presentation mode in Visual Studio. But over here on the left, we have a smaller version of MTM, and we've got a couple options. If this is a manual test and you have no intentions of recording it, you can just start the test. And that's probably the most agile way to go, but it's also the most labor-intensive. So if you've identified a test that you know is pretty much a given, like open website and make sure it loads, that's pretty much always going to be there. This is a great example of an action recording. And the action recording is actually going to follow what that end user does throughout the test. So I'm going to click Create Action Recording and hit Start Test. From here, it's actually going to prompt the user to do things. So it's telling us to load up this first member, and there's an @ sign here that populated this with member ID, meta ID 1. So they see it like it's a normal step. That's data we fed in. Excuse me. Then the next thing they're going to see is validate the items that are on there. So, oh, I'm sorry. Chris pointed out a great thing here. If I've done that first step, I simply click the drop down next to it and say, hey, that passed. It actually worked. Then I go to the next and it says validate the items below. And they've broken this out to a bunch of different items so that we can actually mark each one as success or fail. So in here, I'm going to go ahead and say pass because we can see all the data. I can see a name, and of course I'm using my imagination since there's no browser next to my testing window. But I would assume I could see date of birth, primary address, phone number, Medicaid ID, all those great things. This just passed. Once I'm done up here at the top, I'd hit save and close. That's going to record this as a successful test. And Chris, you want to talk about these coded UI tests that we have on the slide deck behind us and what happens when I finish this test here?
You bet. So here's a lot of value out of this test from clicking action recordings. All the steps that you just took from that action recording are checked into Team Foundation Server. I, as a developer, can now go and create a new coded UI test. I can pull up that past test, load in that action recording, and I can programmatically rerun that test. And I can put assertions in to assert that each of those things that you validated are actually happening. And then I can associate that as a test automation, and I can begin to build that in as a regression test suite that happens just by clicking Run All Tests.
Mm-hmm. And this gives us a great chance to take advantage of our test-driven development approach. If we've already written a number of unit tests that test individual components of the functionality, and someone goes through later and creates an action recording that goes through and does each of these different steps, we can associate that with the unit tests we've already gotten there. Now we immediately see not just code coverage, which comes out of Visual Studio, but real-world coding depth. And we can start to see when people do these automated tests and these coded UI tests, how much of that did our developers really capture up front, and how much is new ground that we really need to cover in testing. So a huge lift in our overall quality. There's also some ability to do some exploratory testing here. So we can do exploratory testing, where we go through and actually just explore the system and test different various things. And later we can view the end results of what exploratory testing happened when we just set a user loose on the system to see what happened inside of the system.
And what you see right here is no results because I don't give my testers any time to do exploratory testing yet.
No, not yet. We've actually been keeping them quite busy on writing more functional tests. So the next thing on our slide deck, we still have about 30 minutes left, which is really good. So the next thing that we saw out of Team Foundation Server was a new focus on things beyond code, like we talked about earlier. So now you have great things like DevOps, a DevOps focus, so incorporating those things like OpsMan so that we can see errors right away, or lab management, or other tools like that. Actually, we're going to go into those on the next slide. Let's just fast forward here a little bit. There we go. So some of the highlights of that are we have things like global service monitoring now. That means that once we've written all these tests, or we've integrated a tool set called OpsMan or APM, or some of the older school developers may know it as Avi code before the Microsoft purchase. Once we incorporate all that suite, we can actually deploy our tests out to a variety of different end test units. And it's just got a great little battery low message on this end, so bear with the background noise for a moment. But we can actually push those tests out to Azure servers throughout the world. And we can see how our system performs for an end user in Asia versus an end user in Europe. And actually get reports back, thanks Chris, get reports back on the performance of our site around the world. We can also get things like what we're going to demo in a second, which is IntelliTrace right out of OpsMan. So if an error occurs, we can pull it right into Visual Studio, right into IntelliTrace, and step through that error as we would if we were in debug mode when the error occurred, and have very little impact in the actual production system. Or Chris, you want to talk about lab management a little bit and the TFS integration there?
Sure thing. So if you have a System Center VMM set up, you're able to, from that Microsoft Test Manager IDE, you can set up lab deployments for your testing. So if you have something that's more complex, and let's say the deployment that's required in order to test the application or the software solution that you're building needs, let's say maybe half a dozen servers and a couple of desktop components and that type of complexity, we can actually pre-build the virtual machines that we want and we can deploy out all of the different software as part of the build process for our testers. So then our testers aren't waiting on our developers or our ops people to spin up an environment for them to test. They can go into lab management and they can say, I'm ready to do this testing, and it can be an automated process to spin up that entire environment for them. Mm-hmm.
And we can do the same thing with some orchestrator implementation as well, which is another part of or System Center, I'm sorry. And like we mentioned earlier, when in-release comes out, we'll have additional feature sets from there that let us have predefined automated deployment paths that do our builds and our deployment out. So one of the questions from the audience was, can we do auto builds similar to something like cruise control? Well, I would say we can go quite a bit beyond cruise control. And I believe, wasn't it 2010 that we got MS Build capabilities right into TFS?
So we actually, we're in the process now of those MS Build capabilities moving into more of a virtualized workflow. So from 2010 to 2012 and 2012 to 2013, we had the ability to go in and do Windows workflows, Windows Workflow Foundation build process templates. So we can go in there and you can arbitrarily drag and drop in a different component to add capability to your build process. Yeah, we certainly have that ability. We define sometimes custom code activities even that we build, compile in, and drag and drop on that design surface. So quite a bit of flexibility there.
Yeah, and when in controls merged in 2013, that'll get even easier.
Right.
For those that haven't played with it yet, you can go to, I believe it's Cycle's website, which you can get off of Bing or Google or whatever search engine you prefer, and pull down their in-release version now to start incorporating it into some test labs before it's in 2013. And it just enhances that even further. So cruise control was the beginning. TFS, I think, has really taken it to a new level that's about to really give us some lift in the marketplace.
Yep. And one of the nicer things there, I think, is that your build processes can be manual builds, they can be scheduled builds, they can be continuous, true continuous integration, or they have a really nice feature where they can say, I want to do continuous integration, but I only want to do it as often as every 30 minutes, for example, if you have a limited resource build controller and you want to pool up those changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a number of different approaches there. So the one that I like the best about this is I really like to be in code if I'm in code. I hate fixing bugs. And the thing that I see as the biggest waste in any development cycle is taking really good developers and putting them on debugging crap. If a bug happens in a real-world environment, it's a shame. It's horrible. Our customers have to wait. They experience inconveniences. I don't like that, but the thing I like even less is seeing a good developer focused on that, because there's so many other things that they can be doing to drive innovation and make the company better. So one of the things that's really got me excited about the newer versions of TFS is what comes with the DevOps tool set. So let's jump into a real quick demo of that here. So we're not going to demo System Center. That's a little bit, I guess, sysadmin-ish. But let's look at the output of this. So I'm in Visual Studio, I'm in Visual Studio 2012, and I've created this new query called Operational Issues. And Operational Issues basically is a subset of new product backlog items that are coming directly from our System Center deployment. And they're things that the system's picked up. So here's a security failure that's happened. Here's an application error. A number of different errors that have come through on this demo system. I've jumped ahead and actually opened up one IntelliTrace file, and this is what comes back in the case of an error from that OpsMan system. And it shows me all the possible things that could have gone wrong. And I selected this one here because in advance I know that that was my actual error. Some of the other ones, like this site.css, that really didn't contribute to the error. It was just picked up as an error by IntelliTrace while it's watching the system. But this one in particular, I can see here that it has something to do with what we see in the top line of this call stack. This Fabricon fiber.web.viewmodels.employee report viewmodel.getCustomer summary. I know just from looking at it that somewhere in here there's a view model. That view model has a function called getCustomer summary. Something's wrong with my data. But how do I actually get to what caused that issue to happen? Well, I can simply double-click on that item or click this Start Debugging button down here. And what this is going to do is grab that call stack, load it up from memory. Now I'm right into IntelliTrace, actually looking at that code, and I can see, okay, I was right. I do have this employee report view model. I've got this get customer that came in. The customer was loaded up and passed through. And from here I can do a number of different things. I can actually go to the previous call in IntelliTrace. This particular file I happen to know doesn't have that data because of configuration of this demo. But another option is I can actually step through, see what happens next from here. So you guys can't see my keyboard, so I'm going to use the on-screen prompts, and I'm going to say, let's show the next statement. And let's just kind of step through this from here. And we're just going to run right through our code just like we normally would, and we can actually see it loading every piece of what it took to get here and what happened after we got here. So really powerful tool set. If this was in a deeper configuration or a real-world environment, we could go backwards and forwards in this error and actually see it loading the page, loading the data, what customer precisely was loaded, where did that error occur, all kinds of different things that can come right of that DevOps tool. The other thing that we can do, though, aside from that, is we can make this more of a human process. Let's say our end user or our CEO is out there using the website, and they notice something broke. Well, maybe it didn't trigger an error. Maybe it's just something that's broke behind the scenes and we don't know about it yet. So we can use another tool set that's one of Chris's favorites, and he kind of mentioned it earlier. And that was the request feedback tool set?
Absolutely. So within TFS, we can go to request feedback. And this has been probably the tool that our non-technical folks have enjoyed the most in the new version of TFS here. And that is I can go through and I can select a stakeholder. We'll make Brian our stakeholder here. And we're going to ask Brian to start a web application. Let's say go to Microsoft.com. We're going to give him a little bit of instruction on what we're asking him to do. Please load Microsoft.com. And then we're going to ask him for some feedback. We're going to say, take a look at that new Surface RT pricing. And we're going to ask him what we feel about it. How do you like the ads? Okay, and that's just one targeted piece of feedback that I'm going to ask for. I can go through and I can add more, and it'll continue to add more. But we'll go ahead and we'll say we want to preview that. And this is what the email is going to look like that Brian will get. We're asking for your feedback. It's going to give him an active link and the ability to install this feedback tool. This feedback tool is free of licensing. Whoever gets this feedback request doesn't have to have a license for TFS in order to use that. And we'll just go ahead and send that out.
I didn't actually get my name back.
Didn't get your name in there yet, did I?
No, oh, check name.
Brian Blanchard. I always spelled brain instead of Brian, and it never works.
You're not alone. I think it's a Freudian slip.
All right, so I might not have the SMPD on for that. So let's take a look. We'll let that go through. Anyway, that'll pull up the feedback tool, which actually looks just about like what you saw from the test manager, and it'll allow your participants to provide audio, video capture, screenshots, free-form text, upload attachments. They can have an entire discussion about that feedback.
So basically, I think the big message with this, though, is we've got these MTM tools to increase quality in the development cycle. We've got the Opsman tools to increase quality once we go post-development and we get into production. And we've got other integration tools to request feedback from the end user so we can increase quality even beyond the level of a bug fix. So quality is one of those big drivers that we see throughout everything in 2012. And it's one of the biggest reasons why it makes sense to make the investment in that tool set, even beyond the cool dev stuff that we can show off.
Speaking of.
Yeah. So now we get to the really cool stuff. So what we talked about up to this point is everything that was covered in Tech Ed regarding Visual Studio 2012 and where it was at. We felt it was important to share that because we know a lot of people haven't really got to dive deep into Visual Studio or TFS 2012 family. But now we're going to get into the even newer, cooler stuff, and that's the Visual Studio 2013 family. And this is where we really see that switch that we talked about before. So at the center of everything in 2013, we have TFS as the core now. Again, it's not that ancillary product. It's even closer to our needs in Visual Studio. Wrapped around that are things like project management integration that we talked about earlier. So if we want to integrate into Project Server and tie back to there, if we want to manage requirements or user stories or anything else, we've got that like we've talked about. Of course, we've got version control. We've got the customizable processes, which we talked about. We covered build automation. We still have the test case management because MTM came over. We have the end-to-end traceability, which we didn't actually talk about in the 2012 stack. I'm surprised with that. The ability to actually tie back in code changes to those user stories or requirements and specify which one was related to which user story.
Yeah, and that actually gives your testers the ability to simply take a look at the latest build that got pushed out, and they'll get notified of which all user stories were impacted. And because of that, they'll be able to know which tests they need to rerun.
Mm-hmm. And we talked about lab management, so those pieces are all incorporated in the TFS. Some of the biggest ones there, let's just take a quick look over that. We've got some better visualizations and requirements management, which we'll talk about when we do the TFS as a service approach. We've got a little bit of lift in the test case management, but overall it's been a lot more polishing, it seems, than anything at the TFS piece and tying it in with better integrations. And surrounding it, we've of course got the Visual Studio integration, which gets better and better every single release, it seems. But now they're focusing on other things. So we have the project server integration, being able to feed back and forth actual hours spent, time tracking, all of that, direct from Visual Studio into TFS, into project server. So it can be rolled up to a PMO level and reported to the CEO or CIO. We got the System Center integration we talked about. So ServeMan, which we didn't mention, for pushing in help tickets. So if someone calls in and reports an error, and then they can track through TFS. We've got OpsMan for performance, Orchestrator for automation, and even ConfigMan to configure your labs to make sure they have the latest patches on them and test all that out. We've got the Windows Azure integration, which has gotten stronger with TFS 13 and a little bit easier to implement. This is quite hard to do in 2012. So for our Azure developers out there, it may take a little bit of time to get your automated builds deployed there. Really solid SQL Server integration, so better analytics services, stronger reports, a couple more reporting options, and more importantly, easier custom report development. So it's gotten a little bit easier in 13. And now we've got all these other access tools. And I think this is probably the biggest addition to TFS, both in 2012 and 2013, that ability to integrate with Office. So now we didn't demonstrate it thus far, but in 2012 and 2013, you have the concept of PowerPoint storyboardings. So whenever you're going in to do a new development effort, and keep asking the product owner or the stakeholder, what do you mean? What are you trying to get us to build? You can give them a copy of PowerPoint and say, you know what, drag some fields on. Put a button up here. Save it. It's in PowerPoint. You know PowerPoint. Of course, we've listened to many of your PowerPoint presentations and taken a good nap or two to many of them. So we know you can use it. So now make it look the way you want the site to look. We also have some deeper integrations with SharePoint. On the slide a few back, you probably saw that there's a good emulator in Visual Studio now and the ability to integrate some things there. And there's the Team Explorer Everywhere concept, so the approach of actually getting into this data via the web. And we'll look at that with the Team Foundation Service stuff as well. So that's the big overview and where the world's going in Visual Studio and TFS. So let's turn this from the big picture into something really tangible and fun to play with. So when we look at those expanded ALM and BLM capabilities, we've got a few things that we can show off here. And again, that BML was that build, measure, and learn. So going beyond development and into those cycles of how do you make development better. And we're going to see some of this through the lens of TFS. Do you want to do slides first, or do you just want to jump right into the demos?
Well, in the interest of time, let's go ahead and knock through those slides real quick, because I want to make sure people have seen a lot of TFS. I want to make sure they get a chance to see Visual Studio.
You know, that's probably a good point. They might be getting sick of TFS by now. Okay, so you want to just walk through the slide decks here then?
Sure thing. So there are view enhancements, as you can see in our little slide here. Everything was kind of in a big flat list without much color in the 2012 version. In 2013, what you're going to get are color coding for everything. More importantly, you're going to get the ability to go into different sprints and view boards for future and past sprints. So anybody who's actively using the Kanban board in TFS has probably felt that pain. So those are the biggest differences from that management level, but we also get features. You can roughly equate a feature to an epic. The way they're laying it out here in the diagram that you see, we have user stories associated to epics, or we have product backlog items associated to features.
Cool. So for the sake of time, we've got about 10 minutes left, so let's blitz through these, because like you said, we got to show off some of the cool Visual Studio 13 stuff.
So collaboration rooms, we can put this up on a big TV for the whole room, and we get publishing of the discussions that we're having around code. We get notifications of build successes, commits, and so on. Go ahead and advance.
There's nothing more fun than seeing something pop up on the board that says, Brian failed at code check-in.
That's right.
Quick way to get razzed.
Brian broke the build. Get the non-scap today.
That's why I don't get to write much code anymore, it seems.
We took a pretty good look, I think, at testing and the test case overview. So let's, we saw NTM. There's some new capability for load testing via test agents that are out in Azure. We won't probably have time to spin that up to show you today.
Yeah, but the cool part about that is once you've got your tests defined, you can deploy out there, and like we said earlier, hit them from all over the world and see how your app actually performs.
They've added Git as a source repository capability under TFS. So you get all the same TFS tooling, but the ability to use Git repos. So for any of your teams that are doing cross-platform development. You can now use TFS natively with Xcode, which doesn't have a plug-in architecture for source control.
Thank goodness.
Team Explorer worked fine, and Eclipse if you were using it. But if you're using any of the other Java development environments, you can now also use TFS for that.
Mm-hmm. And the thing I didn't understand until just a few days ago is that when we talk about that Git for on-premise TFS, it doesn't actually change the server per se. The server's still using good solid source control standards, and you're not going to have to install a separate Git server. It's just managing that Git approach to source control inside of TFS.
Right.
It's a pretty cool feature. We talked in release till it's blue in the face. We'll just move on right past that. And let's jump right into the IDE review. And let's quickly blitz through the slides like we did with that one, and then come back and just do some show off. So the first one here is, of course, the development environment's getting a little bit prettier. They're trying to make it more of a natural interface for people. So you're seeing a little bit more color in the slide, or color in the IDE, a little bit more depth in some of the additional views that we can get and things like that. The things that I like best are probably the CodeLens, the peak, and the scroll bar. We'll talk about those in just a minute. CodeLens is basically a heads-up display for your code, and this doesn't really do it great justice, but we'll just walk kind of through the view here. Right above public action result create, we see two references. That means that there are two other methods that are referencing this method, and if we hover on them, we can see exactly what those methods are. Next to that, we see Brian Keller +2. That means that Brian Keller has made the last update to this code base, and we can actually look at the change set and see the comments that were plugged in updates deployed to TFS or checked in with TFS. So we can see what was changed when this method was changed.
So yeah, what I like to call that is it's now really easy to play the blame game whenever something's broken.
Oh, easily. Well, and that's another thing that's not shown on this particular demo, and we probably won't have time to show today. But if you actually fail one of your tests, your unit tests inside of your source code, whenever you run your test, you can actually see a -2 in bright red next to it that says you changed your code, you failed these two tests. You can hover on them and see where the test failed and figure out what you actually did to break the code. See, we have the unified performance and diagnostics. So this gives us one hub for testing performance across multiple platforms, be it 8.1 or the new Blue release.
Yeah, and here's where we can make sure that our websites are ENERGY STAR compliant.
Oh, absolutely. We all have to be ENERGY STAR compliant. But there is some value in that, isn't there?
Yeah, there is actually, because we're always critically worried about how bad we're hurting the battery on these mobile devices that we have. And if we're doing something like an active loop where we could instead do something async and we get a better energy rating on that application, we should be doing it.
Mm-hmm. So we've got a little bit more advanced debugging. So memory dump analysis gets a little bit deeper. We can actually drill down a little bit deeper in our reference graphs. And as you saw earlier, there's IntelliTrace in 2012, and it gets a little bit better in 2013. And we have some deeper OpsMan with the R2 preview for System Center. And really quickly, taking a look at web development, one of my favorite changes about this is in Oakwood and any other company that I've been involved in, we've always got that division inside the ASP.NET guys. There's some guys that want a traditional web form, some guys that want MVC. More and more we're seeing people that want web APIs so they can go back and forth between MVC and service calls in the same project. Well, now we've got the ability to do all three. We'll demo that in just a quick second here. But basically we can create one project that has the capability to be natively an MVC app. So everything's loaded as MVC the way we like it. But we can also add in web forms and web API right in parallel with that. And it doesn't matter. So we've taken that piece out of the argument. We've also got some revamped security capabilities. So when we start our project, we have the choice of no authentication, individual user accounts, which can come from outside providers like Facebook, Google, etc. And we can also use Windows authentication. So our AD authentication incorporation is so much faster than it ever has been before. And we've got something called Browser Link, which gives us real-time website redesign and testing and the ability to refresh a page a little bit quicker and see those results. So let's hop off into some demos, and we're just going to play for the last few minutes here. If we run out of time, we're not going to be the least bit offended if you guys fall off, and we'll just try to plug through these demos rather quickly here. So we've got TFS opened up, and we can see here on the right we've got a little bit more color in our team project area. I'm just going to go ahead and open up a new project and show off that one ASP stuff. So now when we go to open a new web project, we have just ASP.NET Web Apps. We don't have a lot of choices there or decisions to make. We can go Visual Studio 2012 and make a specific decision, but let's go with the 1ASP.NET. So we hit OK. We go in here, and my favorite personally is MVC, or depending on the day, maybe Web API. It really depends on the utilization. But I also want to add web forms. Let's make sure we can use those too. And I'm going to say let's add some unit testing. And I have no authentication configured for this one. I'm going to go ahead and create a project. At that point, I could have added configuration for authentication and added Facebook and all that, but it'd take just a little bit longer to load up the app itself. So we're going to let this go ahead and churn just for a second here. Okay, went ahead and got that open. So I'm going to dig in and let's take a look at my controllers here. I'm going to go to the home controller, and in just a second it's going to do some loading up here of that CodeLens componentry. But while we're waiting for that, look at my scroll bar. This is really interesting, that I can actually scroll over the lines of code and see this heads-up display. I can also see if I have a really long bit of code base, when I scroll down, I can see this view change and actually see what it is that I have referenced or highlighted. Okay, now we have some references that have popped up. We have 0 references here. That's probably not a great thing. Let's see if we've got any tests in our testing package down here. Oh, none there. Let's do this values controller. There we go. We'll see a little bit more there. So we don't get a whole lot here because this isn't a real project, but we can hover on that 10 references, or click on it, I mean, and we can actually see that, oh, this is being referenced by a values controller test.delete, and all these different tests that have been written to test out this particular controller. If there's real code as opposed to a test that actually executed some business value, we can see that as well right in that place. If we tied this into TFS right next to that 10 references for the controller, that 1 reference for the method, we could see, again, who's checked it in and things along those lines. So those are the things that I've seen really viable in new releases. Chris, anything else that I'm missing here?
I think if we had to tie it into TFS, we could show them some more things, but I think as we currently have this project set up and in this amount of time, we probably won't get to do a whole lot more. They did make it quite a bit easier to add your own tiles here on Team Explorer, so that if you have some capabilities inside of your organization that you'd like to expose to all of your developers, this plugin architecture, I think it took about 15 lines of code to write something there.
Yeah, pretty quick and easy for our internal development efforts. Okay, so I think that covers everything we really wanted to show off. Just got a little bit of a taste of some of the new stuff in 2013. We're currently working our plan to actually lay out a strategy for doing more webinars on 2012 and 2013 to show each of these different individual features we've flown over at a greater depth and really dig into them. So if you attended today, definitely stay in or keep your eyes open for an email that lays those out to start sometime in late August, early September. And we've got 1 minute left, and we've got probably 40 questions on the board, so it's unlikely we're going to be able to get all those questions blasted through in 60 seconds. Let's see if there's any we can hit really quickly. The AD setup that you saw earlier for TFS, that was actually on-prem. Our TFS here is not deployed to Azure, and we're using TFS as a service. Does that connect to AD, or is it strictly TFS as a service? Do you recall?
So actually, when it's out in the TFS service, we have some funny terminology. We have Team Foundation Service, which is the hosted version in Azure. We have Team Foundation Server.
Good point.
So whenever we talk about Team Foundation Server, that's going to be connected up to AD. When we're talking about Team Foundation Service, those are Windows Live accounts.
Cool. And then we'll dig into each of these questions deeper if we miss the actual answer and shoot some answers back to you. Next one on here is, can you interact with Project Server for time tracking? Absolutely, and we highly suggest it. And you know what? I'm getting the big hook pulling us off to the side here. So the rest of the questions we have up on the board, look for an email to get those answers back to you. And feel free to shoot any additional questions over to Chris and myself. And our emails are up on the screen now. And we're going to keep our eyes open for any additional questions you guys might have. Other than that, thanks a lot for joining us.